So, I quite recently decided to put on my Facebook status that I was in an open relationship with a close friend of mine, Crystal. And when I decided to start using Facebook as this sort of means for me to work through a lot of ideas, my Facebook page became not performative, but a lot of performance. And a lot of self-aware performance because of certain questions that I'm asking myself, and that I kind of want to use this medium to ask a more general crowd. Like, what exactly is an open relationship, particularly between two women? Is it me making a statement to the brown community and to the rumors that I'd heard around Crystal, saying that I'm very openly identifying with her, and I would very vigorously defend anything that I heard about her? Was it an acknowledgement that, well, from my particular perspective, female relationships exist on this spectrum where there can be something that's in between just the normal sort of maybe frivolous relationships that you have or that I have with women in my life, and something in between that doesn't broach sexuality or doesn't broach sex at all? Or is it an admission? Was it my coming out saying that I'd like to have a sort of steamy lesbian sex with Crystal every once in a while? Or is it all of the above? I don't know, but I put that out there because I think generally um, something really interesting is happening where pleasure, which is an intensely internal process that exists in many, many, many forms. Sedgwick actually mentions this in this epistemology of the closet, that she finds it a little bit ridiculous that we bifurcate and put a binary on what pleasure and what sexuality is and what it can do. That, if, for example, Mr. Hands, if you have never Googled that video, do so at your own risk. A man who died because he received quite a bit of pleasure being fucked in the ass by a horse, and I think he died of like a punctured colon or something. Um, the first point I want to make is that I think in a really dangerous way, pleasure has been psychologized into discourses of desire. And if we look at the Lacanian definition of desire as that which can never be attained, pleasure has turned into this endless, or has entered, I guess, this endless loop of discursivity. And I really do think that that's filtered into the vernacular. It's filtered into um, the really stringent ways that we assess what pleasure, what desire, what sexuality can and can't be. And we were talking in class, I'm auditing this class on gender, liberalism, and post-colonial state, where a lot of really provocative questions are coming to the surface, such as, well, last week we did a reading of Foucault's History of Sexuality, the third part, where he talks about the deployment of sexuality, which really you should understand in terms of his, not rejection, I won't say rejection, that's too polemic, but how he complicates the repression hypothesis that is sort of, that has sort of dominated 19th century discourses on sexuality. And the argument that came up in class is, or what I would argue, and this is based on a lot of conversation, is that repression acts discursively as a catalyst to bound sexuality, to materialize it, to externalize it into something that's subject to juridical review, that's subject to, I think, what Foucault calls juridico discursive something or another. I'm sorry, I'm terrible at quoting ideas when they're not right in front of me. So if anybody's interested, I think Toni Morrison's Sula is a great place to start examining these issues of sexuality, or more specifically, the distinctions between pleasure. Pleasure psychologizes desire, and desire discursifies as sexuality, and how it obscures the spectrum, I think, on which sexuality, pleasure, and desire, however you decide to look at it, um, operate on a vernacular sense. And um, yeah, so I think I'm going to end this segment on this one with really just questions about the distinctions between the three, how we internalize the distinctions between the three, and how it leads to um, a lot of ambiguity, in a subject that is really important. And I guess the second point I want to make is that this is not my subscription, or my coming out and identifying as bisexual, primarily because I have large issues with the LGBT movement. I have large issues with the way that they articulated themselves, particularly after the Prop 8 debacle in California, particularly within sort of discourses that started claiming that gay was the new black. Number one, number one, there's a masculinism in conflating the LGBTQ spectrum into just gay, into a positionality that usually reflects the position of, I'm sorry, gay white males. Um, and number two, what about LGBT, or and I'm going to just use queer right now. What about queer people that are of color? How do you efface their identity by saying that gay is the new black? And three, it shows a remarkable ignorance on the part of the people that deploy that, even rhetorically, because if you look at the history of African Americans before Obama, humanity for African Americans has always been filtered through Christianity. It's the only, or it's the primary means historically by which African Americans justified and were able to live their humanity. So to take the Prop 8 and to use it as something that discredits black people, discredits their intellectuality, and confines them to this sort of like realm of ignorance, is ethnocentric at best, but really shows a cynical, sort of unengaged reading of African American history and the role that religion has played in the discourse of humanism, of humanity, and the black body. And I think the gay movement, however you want to identify it, needs to take a serious look at itself. The second point I want to make is that we were talking a lot about the difference between repression and suppression. And I think I just mentioned repression embodies something and makes it subject to legislative discourse. It makes it subject to a public discourse that is rendered through the legislative. But if we start thinking about sexuality, more specifically about pleasure, not desire, as something internal, as something that really I don't really think, I think it necessarily needs to be codified and operationalized, just because it's a term through which we live our identities, our political identities. But at the same time, there's a really dangerous reification, I think, that occurs along those lines, that we need to examine. And a really great point that somebody made in class is the subject of excitable speech. I posted the video of David Banner because while I was in undergrad, I took a seminar on black womanisms, or black feminisms, and there was this anthology, the hip hop anthology, and I went through it, and I was fairly disgusted by it on an elitist level because it hadn't been edited properly, because there were just typos, and it's a neuroticism of mine. I think when you're dealing with like a marginal subject such as the woman, or hip hop, or discourses of womanhood and hip hop, especially considering how they're going to be received in academia, in the discipline, I think that it may be unfair, but there's a burden especially in form, in presentation, so that these discourses are taken as seriously as they need to be. But second, I think a very reductive feminist reading of David Banner would respond how? By talking about masculinism, by protesting X and X and Y, by protesting, and not that the protestations, I'm not taking issue with the act of protesting, but I just want to suggest that if we see ourselves and sexuality as something that's been protested, that not protested, but that's been repressed, then the natural, I guess, line of order would lead to what? Speech as a way to contest that. But does it really? Does excitable speech do accomplish any? Does it accomplish anything? Because I spent the past well, I guess only one semester and a half at Brown, and there's a lot of excitable speech about immigration issues and issues of democracy, and everybody's protesting everything, but are you accomplishing anything? And I'd like to suggest that maybe you aren't, because you're operating from a position that externalizes, that reifies in a really dangerous way the very simple concept of pleasure, that psychologizes it into desire, Lacanian desire, as I'm invoking it here, and then legislatively bounds it as sexuality, wherein sexuality can only really exist in these narrow, very narrowly defined frames. So just a lot of questions, and if anybody's interested, I put on the side some readings that I think have helped me work through this process. So this post is just to raise a lot of questions that I've sort of been working through myself, but I think it's necessary as a whole to think about the distinctions between pleasure, desire, and sexuality, and how those act as sort of a very limited, they limit the operation, they limit the agency of the female, male, transgender, they limit the agency of the body in, I think, really dangerous ways.